Hey guys, and welcome back to Born in the Past. If you enjoy these deep dives into the stranger and often grimmer aspects of history, please consider subscribing. It's a simple click for you, but it makes a huge difference for the channel and allows these stories to continue. Tonight, we are logging off. We are powering down, muting our notifications, and closing our endless tabs. We are traveling to a world devoid of streaming services, of viral videos, of podcasts, and of the constant, low-grade hum of electricity that underpins our entire existence. We are journeying to a time when the most common human experience was something we now spend billions of dollars and countless hours trying to avoid: absolute, crushing boredom. We're going to find out how people had fun before the invention of fun as we know it. Welcome to the strange and often dangerous world of medieval entertainment. Before we can even begin to talk about fun, we have to understand the prison in which the medieval person lived. It was not a prison of walls and bars, but one of time and light. Their lives were governed by two relentless, unforgiving clocks that dictated every moment of their existence. The first and most powerful clock was the sun. In a world without meaningful artificial light, the sun was the ultimate authority. When the sun rose, your day began. You went to the fields, to the workshop, to your duties. You worked as long as there was light to see by, and when the sun set, your productive day was for all intents and purposes over. The night was not a time for leisure, for social calls, or for catching up on your favorite shows. The night was a different country, a dark, cold, and dangerous territory to be endured, not enjoyed. Your world would shrink to the small, flickering circle of light cast by a single candle or the central hearth. The night was a time for huddling together, for whispered stories, and for a fear of the vast, unknowing darkness that pressed in on all sides. This solar tyranny was even more pronounced as the seasons changed. The long, glorious summer days offered endless hours for labor and, perhaps, a brief moment of rest in the twilight. But the winter days were brutally short and dark, offering only a few hours of gray, sullen light before plunging the world back into a seemingly endless night. Fun wasn't something you could schedule. You could only have it when the sun allowed it. The second great clock of their lives was the church calendar. For us, a week is 5 days of work and 2 days of weekend, a predictable rhythm of labor and leisure. For the medieval person, there was no such thing as a weekend. Every day was a work day, unless the church said otherwise. Your only significant time off came during holy days, or, as we now call them, holidays. The calendar was dotted with saints' days and major religious festivals like Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun. These were the sanctioned moments of rest, the officially approved pauses in a life of unceasing toil. So your free time was not your own. You couldn't decide to take a Friday off to relax. You waited, sometimes for months, for the next saint's day on the calendar. This meant that fun, when it did happen, was not a casual affair. It was a rare, precious, and often explosive release of pent-up energy and frustration. It was a community-wide event, a collective exhalation before the return to the daily grind. Now imagine living within the confines of these two clocks. Your days are short. Your free time is rare and dictated by others. What do you do with the hours in between? This is where we encounter the true antagonist of the medieval mind: the great silence. Try for a moment to imagine it. No hum of a refrigerator, no distant drone of traffic, no music, unless someone in the room is physically plucking a string or blowing into a pipe. The soundscape of your life is made up of the wind, the rain, the chirping of birds, the lowing of a cow, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, and the sound of human voices. That's it. And information? Your newsfeed was whenever gossip a traveling peddler brought from the next village over. News that was likely weeks, if not months, out of date. Your trending topics were the price of grain, the health of the local lord, and whether a neighbor's cow had given birth. The flow of new information was not a river, it was a slow, intermittent drip. This combination of a rigid schedule and profound sensory deprivation resulted in a state of being that is almost alien to us. It was a state of deep, pervasive boredom. Boredom was not a temporary feeling to be swiped away with a new video or a podcast. It was the default texture of existence, the background radiation of daily life. The waking nightmare we often explore was not always about war or plague. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing in the world was the horror of an empty mind in a silent room, in the dark, with absolutely nothing to do but wait for the sun to rise again. So, trapped in this prison of time and silence, how did the human spirit fight back? How did people steal moments of joy and chaos from a life of rigid order? The answer, as with everything in the Middle Ages, depended entirely on who you were. In the rigid, unyielding hierarchy of the Middle Ages, there was no shared experience of fun. There were two separate worlds of leisure, as distinct as the coarse woolen tunic of the peasant and the fine silk robes of the lady. First, let us consider the world of the common person, the 95% who toiled on the land. For you, the peasant, leisure was not a right. It was a rare and precious gift. It was a brief ceasefire in the Lomme, grinding war against labor and starvation. Your fun was not something you scheduled or planned. It was something that happened to you, granted by the grace of a holy day or the completion of the harvest. And because it was so rare, it was often explosive, chaotic, and deeply communal. You did not have fun alone. The concept would have been meaningless. Fun was a collective experience, a social glue that bound the village together. It was physical, a way to expend the immense energy built up from a life of manual labor. It was loud, a joyful noise to break the monotonous silence of the fields. And most importantly, it had to be free. Your entertainment was fashioned from what was readily available: an open field, a pig's bladder, your own voices, and a barrel of cheap, cloudy ale. The peasant's fun was about temporarily escaping the grim reality of who you were. It was about losing yourself in the crowd, in the dance, in the drink, for a few precious hours before being forced to remember your place in the world. Now, let us climb the social ladder and enter the world of the nobility. Here, leisure was not a rare escape from life. It was a fundamental and highly structured part of it. If the peasant's fun was a chaotic release, the noble's fun was a carefully staged performance. It was not an escape from their reality. It was a powerful affirmation of it. Every leisure activity was designed to demonstrate, practice, or enhance their status as the ruling, fighting class. The tournament, for example, was not just a sport. It was a high-stakes, incredibly expensive display of military prowess, wealth, and chivalric honor. A knight's armor and warhorse were the medieval equivalent of a modern-day supercar, and a tournament was the chance to show it off. Winning could bring you fame, fortune, and political favor. The modern billionaire might relax by buying a new company. The medieval lord relaxed by putting on 100 pounds of steel and charging at another nobleman with a pointy stick. It was their version of a high-stakes networking event. The noble hunt was similarly a performance. It wasn't about putting food on the table. It was a highly ritualized, exclusive activity that demonstrated the lord's dominion over his land and his prowess as a warrior. Even their indoor games, like chess, were seen as practice for military strategy. Every leisure activity had a purpose related to their role as the ruling and fighting class. So, where the peasants' fun was about community and release, the nobles' was about competition and display. Where the peasants' fun was free and spontaneous, The nobles was expensive and ritualized. One group sought a brief, boisterous oblivion from their station in life. The other sought a grand, formal confirmation of their station in life. One was about blowing off steam. The other was about polishing their personal brand. Understanding this fundamental divide is the key to unlocking the strange world of medieval entertainment. It was a world where a pig's bladder could be a source of immense joy, and where a friendly competition could end in a very real, very expensive death. It was a world where fun was either a desperate communal gasp for air, or another calculated move in the endless game of power. To see how this played out, let us begin where the common man's world truly began and ended, in the smoky, noisy, and vital heart of the village, the tavern. If you were a peasant, your life revolved around three key places: your hut, the field, and the church. But there was a fourth place, a place that served as the beating, boisterous, and often drunken heart of the community. It was the alehouse, or the tavern, and it was the original social network. First, you must erase any romantic, cozy image you have in your head. Don't picture a quaint country pub with a roaring fire, polished brass taps, and a friendly bartender. Picture a larger, smokier, and louder version of your own one-room hut. The tavern was often just a room in the house of the local alewife, the woman who brewed and sold the ale. The floor would be packed earth, covered in stale rushes and whatever had been spilled that day. The furniture would be a few rough, heavy wooden benches and tables, scarred with the knife marks of generations of patrons. The air would be thick with the sweet, yeasty smell of brewing ale, the greasy smoke from the fire, and the pungent aroma of dozens of unwashed bodies packed into a small space. The main attraction, of course, was the drink itself. As we've established, ale was the staple beverage, safer than water and a source of liquid calories. It was served at room temperature from a large wooden barrel, in mugs made of wood, leather, or crude pottery. It was likely cloudy, slightly sour, and not particularly strong. But it was wet and it wasn't water. That was good enough. But people did not come to the tavern just to drink. They came for something far more valuable: information. In a world without newspapers, without a postal service, without any form of mass communication, the tavern was the information super dirt road. It was here that you got your news. Your local feed was the stream of gossip that flowed as freely as the ale. You would learn who was sick, whose daughter was to be married, which neighbor was suspected of poaching, and whose cow had just died. This was the vital human data that kept the village running. Your national news came from the rare arrival of a stranger, when a traveling merchant, a pilgrim on his way to a distant shrine, or a soldier returning from a foreign war stopped in for a drink. The entire tavern would fall silent to listen. He would bring news of a battle, a change in taxes, or a rumor about the king, news that was already weeks or months out of date and had been warped and exaggerated with each retelling on its journey. This wasn't journalism. It was a communal exercise in speculative fiction, the only way to get a glimpse of the world beyond the next village. The tavern was your Twitter, your Facebook, your local news channel, and your LinkedIn, all rolled into one sticky, beer-soaked package. It was also the center of commerce and entertainment. A farmer might seal a deal to trade a pig for a sack of seed grain, with a handshake over a shared mug of ale. Men would huddle in a corner, their faces lit by a single candle, hunched over a frantic, high-stakes dice game, betting coins they could not afford to lose. Arguments about property lines would be mediated here, and when a traveling minstrel or storyteller passed through, the tavern would become a concert hall, the entire village packing in to hear songs of heroic deeds or tragic love. Naturally, this combination of alcohol, testosterone, and cramped quarters meant the tavern was also a place of conflict. Disputes over a gambling debt, an old grudge, or a perceived insult would frequently erupt into violent, clumsy brawls. Men would be thrown out into the muddy street, bleeding from a split lip or a broken nose. Arguments weren't settled in a comment section. They were settled in the alleyway out back. The alewife who presided over this chaos was often one of the most powerful people in the village. She was a businesswoman, a confidant, a purveyor of news, and an informal banker who might extend credit until the harvest came in. She heard all the secrets and saw all the deals. To be on her good side was essential. The tavern, then, was a vital and contradictory place. It was a pressure valve for a society under immense strain. It was where community bonds were forged over shared drinks and stories, and where those same bonds were tested by suspicion and violence. It was messy, it was loud, it was unreliable, and it was often dangerous. But in a world of silence and isolation, it was the only network they had. The great festivals were the explosive, scheduled highlights of the year, the sanctioned moments of collective release. But what filled the much longer, quieter gaps in between? What did you do on a normal evening, when the day's back-breaking labor was done, and the oppressive darkness had fallen once more? You couldn't turn on the radio or open a book. You turned to the oldest and most human form of entertainment there is. You listened. Ours is a world of text and screens. Theirs was a world of the spoken word and the shared memory. In a largely illiterate society, the ability to remember and recite stories, poems, and songs was not just a talent. It was a vital social function and a highly respected skill. This oral culture was the primary way that history was recorded, morals were taught, and news was transmitted. And it was the main source of entertainment for everyone. Let's start with the music. The sound of the medieval peasant was not the complex, polyphonic harmony of a church choir. It was rustic, it was raw, and it was alive. The instruments were simple and portable. The pipe, a basic flute carved from wood or bone, could produce a high, piercing melody. The tabor, a small drum swung over the shoulder and beaten with a single stick, provided a driving, infectious rhythm. The fiddle, a precursor to the modern violin, could sing a mournful ballad or a lively dance tune. And in some regions, the wild, skirling sound of the bagpipes was the soundtrack to every celebration. This was music designed for dancing, for singing along to in a drunken chorus, for stomping your feet on a dirt floor until the sun came up. While local talent was common, the true rock stars of the medieval world were the traveling entertainers, the minstrels, the troubadours, the jongleurs. These were the professionals, the walking, breathing repositories of entertainment. The arrival of a minstrel in a village was a major event, a cause for celebration in itself. He was a human playlist, a living library of songs and stories. He would be given the best seat by the fire in the tavern or the great hall. His mug would be kept full of ale, and he would have the rapt, undivided attention of the entire community. He brought with him songs of heroic battles, tales of tragic love from distant lands, and satirical verses mocking the greed of priests or the foolishness of knights. He was their Spotify, their Netflix, and their favorite podcast, all rolled into one person. You couldn't choose the playlist. You just had to hope his repertoire was better than the last guy's who came through 2 years ago. Alongside the music was the even more crucial art of storytelling. The storyteller was the village cinema. Huddled around the fire, with the wind howling outside, the community would be transported by the power of the human voice. The repertoire was vast. There were the great epic poems, like Beowulf or the Chanson de Roland, long, sweeping tales of heroes and monsters that could take several nights to recite in their entirety. Their version of a binge watch was listening to a storyteller end on a cliffhanger, promising to continue the epic the following evening. There were the lives of the saints, which were the medieval equivalent of inspirational biopics, full of miracles, martyrdom, and moral lessons. And then there were the local tales, the folklore that was unique to your region. These were the ghost stories, the tales of fairies, goblins, and ancient spirits that lived in the nearby woods or haunted the old Roman ruins. These stories served a dual purpose. They were thrilling entertainment, but they were also practical warnings that taught children which parts of the forest to avoid and why you should never fall asleep under a hawthorn tree. But this oral culture had a fundamental weakness. It was unreliable. There was no single, authoritative version of any story or song. It changed with every telling. The minstrel might forget a verse and improvise a new one. A storyteller might embellish a tale to better please his audience. News that traveled orally from one village to the next was like a real-life game of telephone, with details being warped and exaggerated at every step. Forget fake news on the internet. Their entire information ecosystem was essentially collaborative fan fiction. The truth was simply whatever the last person who told the story said it was. So while we are drowning in a sea of digital content, they were starved for it. A single new song or a well-told story was a precious commodity, something to be savored, memorized, and repeated until it became a part of the village's collective consciousness. In their world of profound silence, the sound of a fiddle or the voice of a storyteller was more than just fun. It was a profound act of creating light in the darkness. While stories and songs could soothe the soul and pass the long, dark hours, they did little to burn off the immense physical energy and pent-up aggression of a life of manual labor. For that, you needed something else. You needed sport. But medieval sport was nothing like the organized, rule-bound, and highly commercialized spectacle we know today. It was a chaotic, brutal, and often bloody affair. The undisputed king of these sports was a game that went by many names, but is now generally known as folk football. Forget FIFA and the World Cup. Medieval football was a different beast entirely. Let's start with the equipment. The ball was typically an inflated pig's bladder, sometimes encased in a rough leather shell to give it more durability. It was lumpy, unpredictable, and probably smelled exactly as you would imagine a pig's bladder would. The field was not a neatly marked pitch of green grass. The field was the landscape itself. A typical game would be played between two neighboring villages, and the goal for each team was to get the ball to a specific landmark in their own village, often the church door or the local watermill. The distance between these two goals could be several miles, and the playing field included open fields, woods, rivers, and the muddy streets of the villages themselves. And the teams? There was no set number of players. The team was, essentially, the entire able-bodied male population of your village versus the entire able-bodied male population of theirs. The game would often be played on a major holiday, like Shrove Tuesday, and would serve as an annual, violent settling of the score between a year's worth of inter-village rivalries. The game would begin with the pig's bladder being thrown into the air, midway between the two villages. What followed was immediate and total chaos. A great, heaving scrum of dozens, sometimes hundreds of men would converge on the ball. And the rules? There were virtually no rules. You could kick the ball, carry it, throw it. You could also tackle, shove, punch, and wrestle your opponents to the ground. It was a swirling, muddy, violent mass of bodies, all focused on the single objective of moving the ball, by any means necessary, towards their goal. Imagine you are in the middle of it. The roar of the crowd is deafening. You are shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors, pushing against the men from the rival village. The ball squirts free, and you make a run for it, only to be immediately tackled and thrown into a muddy ditch. The game would surge back and forth across the countryside for hours. It would trample through farmers' fields, smash through fences, and splash through freezing rivers. Injuries were not just common, they were expected. Broken bones, dislocated joints, and bloody noses were all part of the fun. Occasionally, people even died. This wasn't a sport you watched from the sidelines with a beer and a hot dog. It was a full-contact, village-wide brawl that you were lucky to survive. Of course, not all sports were this anarchic. Wrestling was incredibly popular, a common feature of any village fair or festival. Young men would grapple in a ring of spectators, eager to prove their strength and win the prize, which might be a ram or a new cloak. Archery contests were also a beloved pastime, especially in England, where the longbow was a crucial military weapon. These contests were a chance to display a more refined skill, a test of a steady hand and a sharp eye, and the winner would be celebrated as the local hero. Games of strength, like throwing a heavy stone or a blacksmith's hammer, were also common ways for men to establish a pecking order. But what was the point of all this violent, chaotic fun? It was, in essence, a massive release valve. It was a way for a community to channel its aggressions, its rivalries, and its immense physical energy into a ritualized and usually non-lethal conflict. It was about community pride. Your victory in the great football game was a victory for your entire village, a year's worth of bragging rights over your rivals. And for the young men involved, it was a crucial way to prove their manhood, to show off their strength and courage in a world that respected little else. So, when you think of medieval sports, don't picture elegant athletes performing for a passive audience. Picture an entire community engaged in a raw, physical, and dangerous celebration of its own strength and resilience. They didn't play for multi-million-dollar contracts. They played for pride, for glory, and for the simple, brutal joy of proving that they were tougher than the men from the next village over. While the children of the peasantry were playing with sticks and stones in a muddy village lane, the sons of the nobility were being prepared for a much more sophisticated and infinitely more dangerous kind of game. We now leave the world of communal survival and enter the realm of individual glory, the world of silk, steel, and spectacular violence, the tournament. If a peasant's fun was a rare break from work, a nobleman's tournament was a massive work project in itself. It was the medieval answer to the Olympics, Paris Fashion Week, and a heavy metal concert having a very violent baby. A great tournament was a multi-day festival that drew lords, knights, and ladies from hundreds of miles around. The site would be transformed. A vast field would be set up with the lists, the fenced-off tilting yard for jousting. Around it, a temporary city of brightly colored pavilions would spring to life, each tent adorned with the unique coat of arms of a competing champion. The air would buzz with the sound of trumpets, the chatter of merchants selling their wares, and the excited murmur of the richly dressed spectators. At the heart of this spectacle was the knight. He was the celebrity athlete of his day. A famous champion like William Marshall or Jacques de Lalagne had a reputation that was known across Christendom. They were superstars, and like any modern superstar athlete, they had the best equipment money could buy. A knight's full suit of plate armor, a marvel of custom engineering, a high-performance piece of wearable technology tailored precisely to his body. It was incredibly expensive, often costing more than a small farm. It was his Formula One car, his prized possession, and his primary defense against a violent, high-speed death. The most iconic event of the tournament, the one that has completely captured our historical imagination, is the joust. This was the one-on-one contest of skill, a highly ritualized and deeply symbolic performance of mounted combat. Two knights, encased in their glittering steel shells, would take up positions at opposite ends of a long, fenced-off field known as the lists. A wooden barrier, or tilt, often ran down the center to prevent head-on collisions, which were considered poor form and were also spectacularly fatal. Imagine what it was like for a moment. You are inside the helmet. Your vision is reduced to a narrow slit. The world is a thin, horizontal line. You can hear nothing but the sound of your own breathing and the muffled thump of your own heart. A trumpet sounds. You spur your massive horse, a beast trained for the shock of battle, into a thundering gallop. You couch your 10-foot-long wooden lance under your arm, a solid beam of ash wood designed to shatter on impact. The ground trembles. The crowd is a blur of color. You see your opponent, a mirror image of yourself, a missile of man and steel, charging directly at you. The moment of collision was an explosion of sound and force. The deafening, violent crack of lancewood shattering on steel echoed across the field. The kinetic energy was immense, enough to throw a man from his saddle and send him crashing to the ground in a clatter of metal. The goal in these jousts of peace was not necessarily to unhorse your opponent, but to score points. You earned points for breaking your lance cleanly on your opponent's shield or helmet. Breaking more lances than your opponent made you the winner of the pass. But do not mistake this for a safe sport. Even with blunted lances, the joust was incredibly dangerous. A splinter from a shattered lance could fly through the eye slit of a helmet, blinding or killing the knight instantly. A poorly aimed lance could strike the horse, causing a catastrophic fall. A direct hit to the head could snap a knight's neck, and a fall from a galloping horse while wearing a small anvil's worth of armor was a very effective way to break bones. King Henry II of France was famously killed in 1559 when a lance splinter pierced his eye and entered his brain during a joust. This was the ultimate performance of the chivalric ideal. It was a test of courage, horsemanship, and martial skill. Knights competed for prizes, a jewel, a ring, a kiss from the queen of the tournament, but more importantly, they competed for honor, for glory, and for the favor of the ladies who watched them. It was a beautiful, deadly, and incredibly expensive ballet of violence. But for all its ceremony and romance, the joust was often just the polished opening act. A bit of individual theater before the main event, a chaotic, team-based battle that was much closer to actual war. The joust, for all its glory and danger, was a performance. It was controlled, it was beautiful, it was theater. The melee, however, was something else entirely. It was the tournament's older, wilder, and far more honest soul. If the joust was the carefully choreographed opening number, the melee was the chaotic, deafening, and often bloody encore. It was the part of the tournament where the pretense of sport was stripped away, revealing the brutal reality of battle that lay just beneath the surface. Forget the single fenced-off tilting yard of the joust. The melee was a full-scale mock battle fought between two large teams of knights. The field could be a vast expanse of countryside, sometimes spanning the several miles between two villages, which served as the team's home bases. The objective was not to score points by breaking lances. The objective was to physically defeat and capture as many knights from the opposing team as possible before sundown. It was, for all intents and purposes, a war game played with live ammunition. The event would begin with the two teams, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, lining up in formation at opposite ends of the designated territory. A single trumpet blast would sound, and what followed was a thunderous charge. The initial impact was a cataclysmic shockwave of splintering wood, groaning metal, and the screams of men and horses. From there, the battle would dissolve into 100 smaller, desperate skirmishes across the fields and through the woods. It was a swirling, violent, and utterly confusing brawl that tested endurance, teamwork, and raw survival instinct. While the swords were blunted, or supposed to be, the danger was extreme. A well-aimed blow from a mace or a warhammer could still crush a helmet and the skull within it. A knight unhorsed in the thick of the fight could easily be trampled to death. The church, for its part, was horrified by the melee. They repeatedly condemned it as a sinful spectacle of vanity and violence, and frequently threatened to excommunicate any knight who participated. It rarely worked. The nobles loved it too much, and not just for the glory. Because the melee was not just a sport, it was a business. It was a violent, high-risk, high-reward form of aristocratic entrepreneurship. The real goal was not just to defeat an opponent, but to capture them. A captured knight was forced to surrender, and would later have to pay a hefty ransom to his captor to be freed. Furthermore, the victor had the right to seize his captive's horse and armor, which were themselves worth a fortune. A successful day at a melee could make a poor knight rich. A famous knight like William Marshall was said to have captured over 100 knights in their careers, building immense fortunes from the ransom system. Imagine you are a young, landless knight with a great skill but little wealth. You would enter the melee not just looking for a fight, but for a target. You would scan the opposing team for a wealthy baron, someone whose armor showed the fine craftsmanship of a master, whose horse was clearly a prize beast. Your goal would be to isolate him, defeat him, and capture him. His horse alone might be worth more than you would earn in a year. His ransom could be enough to buy you land, to secure your fortune. The melee was the medieval version of a battle royale video game, combined with a hostile corporate takeover. The winner didn't get a medal. They got a portfolio of captured assets. And so, the melee reveals the true complex nature of the medieval knight. He was expected to be a pious, honorable, and chivalrous hero, as demonstrated in the joust. But he was also a pragmatic, professional warrior who understood the economics of violence. The melee was his training ground, his business, and his favorite, most dangerous game. It was where the ideals of the Round Table met the grim reality of the bottom line, all in a chaotic, exhilarating, and often fatal afternoon of fun. When the thrilling, violent, and often profitable chaos of the tournament was over, and the knights had tended to their bruises and counted their ransom money, the medieval nobleman had another favorite arena in which to display his prowess and status. This one was not of turf and timber, but of leaf and shadow. This was a place where a man could prove his mastery not just over other men, but over the natural world itself. We are leaving the lists and heading into the forest for the noble hunt. But you must immediately banish any modern image of a quiet, solitary hunter waiting patiently in a tree stand. Much like the tournament, a medieval noble hunt was a loud, complex, and incredibly expensive social performance. And at its very core, it was an exercise in power. We've already established that the forests and the prized game within it, the stag, the wild boar, the fallow deer, were the exclusive, legally protected property of the aristocracy. For a peasant to hunt these animals was a crime that could cost him his eyes or his hands. For a nobleman, hunting them was a fundamental right and a very public declaration of his status. To hunt the stag was to gallop across the land and remind every serf for miles around that this domain and every creature that lived on it belonged to him. The primary purpose of this grand affair was not, as you might logically assume, to get food. While a freshly killed deer was a welcome prize for the castle kitchen, the staggering amount of resources, manpower, and time expended on a single formal hunt made it a ridiculously inefficient method of stocking the larder. A lord could feed his household for a week on the cost of simply feeding his prized hunting dogs for a day. The goal was not sustenance. The goal was the ritual. It was the chase. The most prestigious form of this was the parforce hunt, or the hunt by strength. This was a grueling, often day-long chase on horseback. The day would begin at dawn with a grand assembly of nobles, ladies, and a whole army of specialized servants. There were the huntsmen who knew the forest like the back of their hand, the kennel masters who managed the hounds, and the horn blowers who served as the communication officers for the entire operation. First, a single skilled huntsman, the limer, would go out with a scent hound on a leash to find the fresh tracks of a suitable quarry, usually a large mature stag. Once the target was located, the full pack of hounds would be released, and the chase would begin. Imagine the sound, the deep baying calls of dozens of hounds, the thunder of 50 or more horses crashing through the undergrowth, and above it all, the clear, complex calls of the hunting horns. The horn was a sophisticated instrument of communication. Different sequences of notes, or mots, would signal every stage of the hunt. The stag has been found. The hounds are in pursuit. The stag has crossed the river. The stag is tiring. It was a symphony of the chase. This was a brutal test of endurance for all involved. A healthy stag could run for hours, leading the hunting party over dozens of miles of punishing terrain. It was a way for knights to maintain peak physical condition, testing their horsemanship and stamina in a way that directly translated to the battlefield. When the exhausted stag was finally cornered, unable to run any further, it would turn at bay to face the snapping pack of hounds. This was the moment of climax. It was considered a great honor for the highest-ranking nobleman present to dismount and deliver the final kill himself, often with a sword or a specially designed hunting spear. It was a moment of personal bravery, facing a large, powerful, and cornered animal. But the ritual did not end there. What followed was a complex and, to our eyes, gruesome ceremony of butchering the animal right there in the forest. This was the grey. The huntsman would lay the animal on its back, and specific, traditional cuts would be made. The stomach would be opened, and the hounds, as a reward for their work, would be allowed to feast on the blood and entrails. This was considered a vital part of their training and bonding. The rest of the carcass was then carefully butchered according to strict protocol, with different parts reserved for different members of the hunting party, a reflection of the social hierarchy, even in the division of the spoils. The noble hunt was far more than a simple sport. It was a vital social ritual, a key part of military training, and a symbolic drama about power and dominance. It was a day of calculated chaos and bloody ceremony that reaffirmed the nobleman's place at the top of the food chain, both literally and figuratively. The fun, for them, was not just in the chase, but in the powerful, public performance of their right to rule the world. The grand hunts and the magnificent tournaments were the peak of fair-weather entertainment. Spectacular events played out under an open sky. But when the rains came, or when the long, dark nights of winter descended, the noble's world would shrink to the firelit confines of the great hall. And here, in the flickering torchlight, a different kind of battle was waged, one of luck, strategy, and nerve. This was the world of indoor games. While we might think of board games as wholesome family fun, in the Middle Ages, they were almost universally associated with one of the era's most beloved and most condemned pastimes, gambling, and the undisputed king of all gambling games, a universal obsession played by everyone from common soldiers in a tavern to the king in his court, was a simple game of chance played with two small, dotted cubes. We are talking, of course, about dice. These were not the perfect, plastic, precision-engineered dice you might find in a casino today. They were carved from bone, ivory, or wood, their sides often slightly uneven, their pips drilled by hand. This gave them a pleasing organic weight, but also meant they were easy to load or manipulate, making cheating a constant concern. A game of hazard would begin with a player, the caster, throwing the dice. The rules were complex, involving specific numbers to be thrown to win, or lose outright, but the essence of the game was pure high-speed chance. A game could be over in a single roll, and a man's fortune could be made or lost in minutes. The atmosphere around a dicing table was one of intense, raw emotion. Men would be hunched over, their faces illuminated by the candlelight, their eyes fixed on the tumbling dice. There would be shouts of triumph, groans of despair, and, most frequently, a stream of creative and often blasphemous curses directed at God, the saints, or the dice themselves when a roll went badly. This was not a quiet, contemplative game. It was a loud, emotional, and often alcohol-fueled affair. And the stakes were terrifyingly real. A knight might bet the prize money he had just won in a joust. A merchant might wager a bolt of fine silk. A nobleman, caught in the grip of a losing streak, might bet his horse, his armor, his wife's jewels, and, eventually, the deed to one of his manors. The stories of men losing their entire inheritance in a single night of dicing are not just fiction. They were a common cautionary tale. Dice were the medieval equivalent of a high-risk cryptocurrency, wildly unpredictable, poorly understood by most, and capable of making you rich overnight, or, far more likely, leaving you with nothing but a headache and a mountain of debt. Naturally, the church despised dicing. Sermons constantly thundered against the evils of the devil's bones. They saw it as the gateway to a whole host of other sins, the idleness of wasting time that should be spent in labor or prayer, the covetousness and greed for your neighbor's property, the blasphemous rage directed at God during a losing streak, and the poverty and crime that often followed a catastrophic loss. But no amount of preaching could stamp out its popularity. The thrill was simply too powerful. For those who preferred a bit of strategy mixed with their luck, there was the game of tables, the direct ancestor of modern backgammon. Played on its distinctive board with 2 sets of 15 pieces, tables required the same roll of the dice as hazard, but demanded considerable skill in how you chose to move your pieces. This blend of chance and strategy made it incredibly popular, especially among the more thoughtful members of the nobility. It was seen as a slightly more respectable way to gamble, a gentleman's game, though the stakes were often just as high. Later in the period, the arrival of playing cards from the Islamic world would provide a new and exciting medium for this obsession. Instantly, card games became synonymous with gambling, trickery, and a new way to lose your money in the quiet hours of the night. These indoor games were a powerful antidote to the crushing boredom of medieval life. In a world where your fate was largely sealed at birth, the roll of the dice offered a moment of pure chaotic possibility. It was a brief, thrilling illusion of control, or perhaps a complete and total surrender to fate. It was a way to feel the intense, heart-pounding emotions of a battle without the risk of physical injury, though the financial wounds could be just as deep. In the long, dark, and silent nights, the simple rattle of 2 bone dice on a wooden table was, for many, the most exciting sound in the world. If dice represented the chaotic, sinful, and thrilling surrender to pure chance, there was another game played in the firelit halls of the nobility that represented its complete opposite. It was a game of pure logic, of deep strategy, and of cold, calculating intellect. It required patience, foresight, and a quiet, ruthless mind. This was not a game for the tavern. This was the game of kings. This was chess. Having journeyed from India through Persia and the Arab world, chess arrived in Europe and was immediately embraced by the aristocracy and high-ranking clergy as a game that perfectly mirrored their own worldview. It was a game of hierarchy, of social order, and of war. To play chess was not merely to pass the time. It was to engage in a sophisticated intellectual exercise, a mark of refinement that separated the thoughtful nobleman from the common rabble. The chessboard was a miniature kingdom, a perfect representation of the feudal world in 64 squares. The pieces were not abstract shapes. They were the very fabric of society, brought to life in carved wood or ivory. At the heart of it all was the king. He was the most important piece on the board, the center of your universe. The entire game revolved around his safety. All of your strategies, all of your sacrifices were dedicated to protecting him. But he was also one of the weakest pieces, able to move only a single cautious step in any direction. His power was symbolic. His actual ability to fight was limited, a perfect metaphor for a monarch who commanded armies but was personally vulnerable. If your king was trapped, checkmated, the game was over. Your kingdom had fallen. Beside him stood the queen. But you must forget the all-powerful board-dominating queen of modern chess. In the early medieval period, the queen was one of the weakest pieces. She was the fares, or advisor, able to move only a single square diagonally. It was only in the late 15th century that her rules evolved, transforming her into the formidable, game-changing piece she is today. A shift that some historians believe mirrored the rise of powerful female monarchs like Isabella I of Castile. The rest of the pieces filled out the social order. The bishop, with his strange diagonal movement, represented the flanking, sometimes unpredictable power of the church. The rook, or castle, represented the heavy infantry or the great siege towers, moving in straight, powerful lines of attack. The knight was perhaps the most cleverly designed piece, its unique L-shaped move allowing it to jump over other pieces, perfectly mimicking the tactical role of heavy cavalry, which could outflank and surprise an enemy infantry line. And then there were the pawns. A sea of 8 identical, humble pieces, representing the common peasant infantry. They were numerous, they were expendable, and their primary job was to march forward and die to protect the more valuable pieces behind them. The game was a brutal but effective teacher of feudal strategy. You must be willing to sacrifice your pawns to achieve victory. Their only hope for individual glory was the rare, almost impossible chance of reaching the other side of the board, where a pawn could be promoted to the great honor of becoming a queen. It was the slimmest of chances at social mobility, built on a near certainty of death. A game of chess was not a loud or boisterous affair. It was a silent war. Imagine 2 powerful nobles sitting for hours by the fire, the only sound, the quiet, deliberate click of a wooden piece being placed on the board. The air would be thick with concentration. Each player would be trying to think 5, even 10 moves ahead, anticipating their opponent's plans, setting intricate traps, and weighing the consequences of every possible action. This was why chess was so highly valued. It was not just a game. It was mental training for the real world of politics and warfare. It taught patience, it taught foresight, and it taught the cold, hard necessity of calculated sacrifice. Forget modern esports. A high-level chess match between 2 dukes was the original intellectual spectator sport, though the commentary was probably much quieter. While a game of dice might offer the cheap, fleeting thrill of a lucky win, a victory at chess was a profound intellectual triumph. It was a confirmation of your mental superiority, a demonstration that you could outthink and outmaneuver your rival. It was the perfect pastime for a ruling class that believed it governed the world not through the chaos of chance, but through the power of strategic design and sheer force of will. The chessboard taught the noblemen how to wage a war of strategy, but there was another game played in the courts of medieval Europe, a game with rules just as complex and stakes that were, in their own way, just as high. This was not a war for territory, but for affection. It was not played on a board, but in the whispered conversations of the court, in the lines of poetry, and in the stolen glances across a crowded hall. This was the beautiful, elaborate, and often fatal game of courtly love. To understand this strange pastime, you must first understand that for the medieval nobility, marriage had almost nothing to do with love. Marriage was a business contract. It was a political alliance, a way to merge lands, secure bloodlines, and consolidate power. You married the person your father told you to marry. Love, that messy, irrational, and powerful emotion, was something that happened entirely outside the practical confines of matrimony. And courtly love was the elaborate system they invented to manage it. The game had a very specific set of rules. The participants were a knight, who was the humble adorer, and a lady, who was the object of his devotion. Crucially, the lady was almost always of a higher social standing, and most importantly, already married, usually to the knight's own lord. This immediately made the love unattainable, and therefore noble and pure. The knight's role was to become his lady's sworn servant. He was to suffer in her name, to be ennobled by his hopeless passion. He would perform great deeds in her honor, dedicating his victories in the tournament to her. He would wear her favor, a scarf, a sleeve, or a glove, tied to his helmet as he charged into the joust, a public declaration of his devotion. A lady's role was to be distant, imperious, and seemingly unattainable. She was expected to be merciful but cruel, to keep her knight in a perpetual state of hopeful agony. She might offer him a small token of encouragement, a smile, a kind word, one of her handkerchiefs, just enough to inspire him to even greater feats of valor and more passionate declarations of love. The entire system was designed not for fulfillment, but for a beautiful, exquisite, and very public form of suffering. The game was played primarily through art. A knight would write, or more likely hire a troubadour to write, elaborate poems and songs praising his lady's beauty, comparing her eyes to stars, her hair to spun gold, and her heart to an impregnable fortress. This was their version of a grand romantic gesture. Forget a fancy dinner or a weekend getaway. A knight showed his love by getting repeatedly hit with a large wooden stick in a tournament while wearing a piece of his lady's clothing as a good luck charm. Now, the official, poetic version of courtly love was entirely platonic. It was a spiritual and emotional connection, a way for a knight to purify his soul through selfless devotion to a superior being. But we are talking about human beings, and so this elegant, elaborate system of platonic worship often served as a convenient and beautifully decorated smokescreen for very real and very dangerous, adulterous affairs. The line between sighing poetically beneath a lady's window and climbing through it was a blurry one, and crossing it was the most dangerous move in the game. This is where the game of hearts became a game of daggers. Adultery, especially between a lord's wife and one of his own knights, was not a mere personal failing. It was an act of treason. It threatened the entire structure of inheritance and bloodlines upon which the feudal system was built. If a knight was caught in a real affair with his lady, the consequences were swift and brutal. The jealous husband, who also happened to be a powerful lord with his own dungeon, would not be inclined to write a sad poem about it. The knight could expect imprisonment, exile, or a quiet, unfortunate accident in a dark corridor. The lady's fate could be equally grim, from public humiliation to being locked away in a convent for the rest of her life. The great romantic tales of the age, like that of Lancelot and Guinevere, were so popular precisely because they were tragedies that everyone knew could and did happen. Courtly love was the ultimate form of noble entertainment because it engaged every aspect of their world. It involved the pageantry of the tournament, the artistry of poetry and music, the intellectual maneuvering of the court, and the very real, thrilling risk of total ruin. It was a psychological game of immense complexity, a way to navigate the powerful and inconvenient emotions of love within a rigid social system that had no other place for them. It was a beautiful and elaborate dance on the very edge of a sword, and for the medieval aristocrat, that was the most exciting game of all. While the nobility were playing their dangerous games of the heart, another, more public form of theater was taking shape in the bustling towns and cities of medieval Europe. This was a spectacle for the masses, a way to bring the greatest story ever told to a population that could not read it for themselves. This was the birth of theater. Like so many things in the medieval world, theater as we know it grew directly from the church. For centuries, the Catholic Mass was performed in Latin, a language that was incomprehensible to the average parishioner. To help the illiterate congregation understand the stories of the Bible, priests began to incorporate small, dramatic reenactments into the service, especially around the major holidays of Easter and Christmas. These simple scenes, known as liturgical dramas, might involve three priests dressed as the three Marys visiting the tomb of Christ, or a representation of the shepherds adoring the infant Jesus. It was a simple visual aid, a bit of religious education through performance. But the idea was a hit. These small plays became incredibly popular, growing more elaborate with each passing year. Soon, they became too big, too boisterous, and frankly, too entertaining for the solemn confines of the church itself. So they moved outside, into the churchyard, and then into the town marketplace. As they moved into the public sphere, the responsibility for producing them shifted from the clergy to the community itself, specifically to the powerful trade guilds. Each guild, or mystery, would take responsibility for staging one particular scene from the Bible, and these became known as the mystery plays. This was the medieval version of a cinematic universe, and the Bible was the source material. The entire town would become a massive, open-air theater for a day-long festival of Scripture. The staging was ingenious. Each guild would construct an elaborate set on the back of a large wagon. These pageant wagons were the original parade floats, and they were a source of immense civic and professional pride. The Shipwrights Guild, for example, might be responsible for the story of Noah's Ark, and they would build a spectacular ark on their wagon, complete with impressive special effects for the flood. The Bakers Guild would stage the Last Supper, often using real bread from their own ovens. The goldsmiths might stage the story of the three magi with lavish, glittering costumes. These wagons would then proceed through the town, stopping at several designated stations to perform their scene for a new audience. For the price of a day's attention, a spectator could witness the entire history of the world, from the creation in the Garden of Eden to the terrifying spectacle of the Last Judgment, all played out on a series of rolling stages. And while the subject matter was sacred, the tone was often surprisingly bawdy and comedic. The plays were written in the common language of the people, not Latin, and they were filled with broad, slapstick humor. The character of Noah's wife, for instance, was often portrayed as a comical, nagging shrew who stubbornly refuses to get on the ark, leading to a physical comedy routine where Noah and his sons have to physically force her aboard. But the true breakout star of the mystery plays was almost always the devil. Accompanied by his bumbling demonic sidekicks, the devil was often a comedic villain, a boastful but ultimately foolish figure who would tumble and roar and make rude jokes, much to the delight of the crowd, before dragging the damned souls down to a hell represented by a great, smoking monster's mouth at one end of the stage. Later in the period, a new genre emerged, the morality play. These were not direct stories from the Bible, but allegorical dramas designed to teach a clear moral lesson. The characters were not people, but personifications of abstract concepts. The most famous of these is Everyman. The protagonist, Everyman, is summoned by death and must prepare for his final journey. He asks his friends, characters named Fellowship, Kindred, and Goods, to go with him, but they all abandon him. Only the character of Good Deeds is willing to go with him. The moral was not subtle. It was the medieval equivalent of a very long, very serious after-school special about the importance of living a virtuous life. This was theater for the people, by the people. It was loud, it was messy, it was often crude, but it was also a powerful communal art form that brought the central stories of their faith to life in a way that no sermon ever could. It was their blockbuster event, their shared cultural experience, and a spectacle unlike any other. The great religious plays were massive, town-wide productions, a form of entertainment that was deeply integrated into the community's civic and spiritual life. But entertainment could also arrive unannounced. It could wander into town on a dusty road, carrying all of its magic in a single tattered sack and the skill in its own two hands. This was the world of the traveling show, the itinerant entertainers who brought novelty, wonder, and news from the outside world to communities that were otherwise largely static and isolated. These performers, minstrels, jugglers, acrobats, and animal tamers, were a class of people all their own. They lived on the margins of society, belonging to no single village or lord. Their life was the road, their home was the next tavern, and their master was the fickle generosity of the next crowd. This rootless existence gave them a certain freedom that a peasant, tied to his land, could never imagine. But it also made them perpetual outsiders, viewed with a mixture of fascination and deep suspicion. The most respected of this group was the minstrel, or the troubadour. We've spoken of them as the human playlists of their day, but they were much more than that. They were walking, talking news aggregators. A skilled minstrel didn't just know songs, he knew the great epic poems, the latest courtly gossip, and the news from distant cities. His arrival in a tavern was an event. For the price of a few mugs of ale and a hot meal, he would provide an evening's entertainment that was also an information dump. He might sing a song about a recent battle in France, recite a satirical poem about a greedy bishop, or tell a romantic tale he heard at a noble court 50 miles away. He was the only link many people had to the wider political and cultural world. Forget podcasts. This was the original long-form narrative journalism, performed live. Then there were the performers who specialized not in words, but in pure physical astonishment. These were the jongleurs, a broad term that covered a huge range of skills. In the middle of the village square, a crowd would gather to watch an acrobat perform a series of breathtaking backflips and handstands on the hard, unforgiving ground. A juggler would keep 5, 6, or even 7 balls in the air at once, a feat of coordination that seemed almost magical. Another might juggle a set of sharp knives, a performance that combined skill with the thrilling possibility of imminent, bloody failure. Some of these performers dealt in even more dramatic arts. The fire eater was a guaranteed showstopper. A man who could seemingly hold flame in his mouth without being consumed was defying the natural order of things. To a medieval audience, for whom an accidental burn was a common and serious injury, this was an act of almost supernatural power. The line between a clever trick, a rare skill, and genuine magic was incredibly thin, and these performers lived right on that line. Their act wasn't just entertaining, it was wondrous. It was a brief, visceral tear in the fabric of a predictable and often dreary reality. The traveling show might also include animal acts. This was the medieval circus in its earliest form. A man might arrive with a bear on a chain, a creature of immense power and fear, that he had trained to dance clumsily to the sound of a pipe. Another might have a clever dog that could perform tricks, or even a monkey dressed in a tiny costume. While cruel by our modern standards, the sight of a wild animal seemingly tamed and bent to a human's will was a source of immense wonder and amusement. For the village, the arrival of these performers was a holiday in itself. Work would stop. Everyone from the children to the elders would gather to watch. It was a break in the soul-crushing monotony, a story that would be told and retold for weeks after the performers had packed up and moved on. They were a splash of vibrant, unpredictable color in a world that was mostly shades of brown and gray. But the life of these entertainers was far from glamorous. They were often desperately poor, their survival dependent on passing the hat after a performance. They were vulnerable on the dangerous roads, easy targets for bandits, and they were viewed with deep suspicion by the church, which often condemned them as vagabonds, charlatans, and purveyors of sinful, lewd entertainment. They existed outside the rigid social structure of lord, priest, and peasant, and this made them untrustworthy in the eyes of authority. They were celebrated for their skills, but shunned for their lifestyle. They were a living paradox, essential to the happiness of the people, but existing on the very fringes of their society. The traveling jugglers and minstrels brought a sense of wonder and novelty to the medieval world. But there was another, far darker, and arguably more popular form of public spectacle. It was a form of entertainment that required no special talent, no poetic verse, and no sleight of hand. It tapped into something much more primal in the human psyche, a thirst for violence, for chaos, and for the thrill of a life-or-death struggle. This was the grim and brutal world of the blood sport. If modern entertainment is largely about escapism and fantasy, medieval entertainment was often a direct, unvarnished reflection of the brutality of everyday life. In a world where death was a constant companion, where violence was a common tool of justice and power, watching it for sport was not seen as a shocking or immoral act. It was seen as a thrilling and perfectly normal way to spend a holiday afternoon. The most famous and spectacular of these blood sports was bear baiting. This was not some back alley affair. It was a major, organized, and highly popular public event. In cities like London, there were purpose-built arenas, or bear gardens, dedicated to staging these spectacles. These were as famous and as well attended as any modern sports stadium. The atmosphere would have been electric. A large, rowdy crowd of people from all social classes, from apprentices and servants to wealthy merchants and nobles, would pack the stands, drinking, shouting, and most importantly, gambling. At the center of the arena, or pit, was the star of the show, the bear. This was a large, powerful animal, a living symbol of the untamed wilderness. But it was not a wild creature in its natural element. It was a prisoner, an unwilling gladiator. Its ankle would be chained to a heavy wooden post in the center of the ring, giving it a limited radius in which to move and defend itself. To prolong the sport and give the dogs a fighting chance, the bear's teeth were often filed down and its claws clipped. It was a hobbled giant, a force of nature reduced to a bloody spectacle for human amusement. Its opponents were a pack of specially bred dogs, usually large, ferocious mastiffs or bulldogs, renowned for their strength and courage. These dogs were valuable assets themselves, trained from birth for this specific, violent purpose. When the crowd was settled and the bets were placed, a trumpet would sound. The dogs would be unleashed into the pit. The goal was simple and savage: to attack the bear, to latch onto its sensitive snout, ears, or throat, and to worry it into submission through pain and exhaustion. The bear, enraged and tormented, would fight back with terrifying force. It would roar, it would rise up on its hind legs, and it would swat at the dogs with its massive, powerful paws. A single, well-aimed blow from a bear could send a dog flying through the air with its back broken, or crush its skull instantly. The crowd would roar with every lunge, every dodge, every spray of blood. They would cheer for a particularly brave dog that managed to get a hold, and they would cheer for the bear when it brutally dispatched one of its attackers. Fresh waves of dogs would be sent in as others were killed or maimed. The spectacle would continue until the bear was too exhausted to fight back, or until the dog's owner conceded defeat. A good bear was a valuable investment, so it was rarely killed in the pit. It would be led back to its cage to recover, to be baited again another day. The dogs were far more expendable. Why did they find this horrific scene entertaining? For one, they were simply desensitized to a level of violence that is shocking to us. But they also saw it as a contest of courage. They admired the ferocity and tenacity of the dogs, and the immense strength and endurance of the bear. It was a raw display of the natural world's own brutal logic. And, of course, there was the gambling. Huge sums of money changed hands based on which dog would perform the best, or how many dogs the bear would manage to kill. This was their pay-per-view heavyweight fight. It was a living, breathing action movie with real blood and real death. It was a raw, visceral, and deeply disturbing pastime that reveals the immense gap between their sensibilities and our own. Their idea of a fun family outing was to go and watch a chained animal fight for its life. And that, perhaps more than anything else, tells you everything you need to know about the waking nightmare of their world. The bear pit was the grand theater of animal cruelty, a major public spectacle. But the thirst for blood sport did not require such a large stage or such a magnificent beast. In the backyards of taverns, in the village commons, and in the private estates of noblemen, a whole ecosystem of smaller but no less vicious entertainments thrived. If bear baiting was the heavyweight championship, then what followed was the bloody, fast-paced undercard. Chief among these was cockfighting. It was perhaps the most widespread and popular blood sport of all. It was cheaper, faster, and easier to organize than a bear baiting. All you needed were two aggressive roosters, and a group of people with coins in their pockets and a thirst for violence. But you must erase any image of two farmyard chickens pecking at each other. This was a science. Gamecocks were special breeds, raised from the egg for one purpose only: combat. They were the feathered gladiators of their day, prized for their aggression, strength, and an unyielding refusal to back down from a fight. Owners treated their champion birds like prize fighters, feeding them special diets and conducting training regimens to build their stamina and strength. But the truly brutal aspect of the sport was the addition of artificial weaponry. Before a fight, the birds would be fitted with gaffs, which were razor-sharp metal spurs, sometimes several inches long, strapped over their natural spurs. This transformed the birds from pecking combatants into slashing, lethal weapons. The goal was not to tire an opponent out. It was to puncture a lung, to sever an artery, to kill. The fight itself took place in a small, circular arena called a pit. The atmosphere would be electric with tension. Two handlers would bring their birds to the center, holding them up to each other to stoke their natural aggression. Then they would be released. The violence was instantaneous and explosive. A flurry of feathers, dust, and blood. The birds would leap at each other, slashing with their metal spurs, aiming for the head and chest. a fight was often over in minutes, sometimes in seconds, with one or both birds lying dead or dying on the floor of the pit. And all the while, the crowd would be screaming. They were not just watching, they were deeply financially invested. Cockfighting was a massive vehicle for gambling. Men would bet on which bird would win, how long the fight would last, or which bird would draw first blood. The owner of a champion cockerel could become a local celebrity, his reputation and his wallet greatly enhanced by the murderous prowess of his bird. Forget fantasy sports leagues. They had a literal one, where your team consisted of angry, weaponized chickens. This cultural acceptance of animal combat was not limited to bears and chickens. The list of blood sports was long and varied. Bull baiting was popular, following the same format as bear baiting, but with a bull, an animal known for its explosive and unpredictable rage. Dogfighting, pitting trained fighting dogs against each other, was also a common pastime. And then there were the stranger, even crueler variations. Badger baiting was a particularly nasty affair. A badger, a notoriously tough and ferocious animal when cornered, would be placed in a man-made den or a box. A dog would then be sent in with the objective of dragging the badger out. The badger's powerful jaws and claws would inflict terrible injuries on the dog, while the dog, in turn, would savage the badger. It was a bloody, subterranean struggle, considered great fun by the spectators. What does this tell us? It reveals a mindset that is almost alien to us, a world where life, both human and animal, was cheap, and suffering was a public spectacle. The line between sport and cruelty was not just blurry. For many, it simply did not exist at all. They saw these events not as torture, but as a thrilling display of the natural world's own savage principles: strength, courage, and the will to survive. The gambling, the noise, the shared, vicarious thrill of the life-or-death struggle. It was all a potent distraction from the hardships of their own lives. It was another way to feel alive in a world that was surrounded by death. And the public's appetite for this kind of spectacle did not stop with animals. The public's appetite for spectacle, for a raw and visceral drama, did not end with animals fighting in a pit. In fact, some of the most popular and well-attended public entertainments involved no beasts at all. They involved their fellow human beings. This was the world of public punishment, a place where justice was not just served, but performed for a captive audience. In the medieval mind, justice was not a private or solemn affair conducted in a quiet courtroom. It was a performance. Its purpose was not just to punish the offender, but to publicly shame them, and, in doing so, to provide a terrifying and unforgettable moral lesson to the entire community. This turned the town square into a theater of humiliation, and the suffering of a neighbor into a form of macabre, state-sponsored entertainment. The most iconic stage for this drama was the stocks or the pillory. These were simple but ingenious devices of wood, built in the most central part of the village. The stocks trapped a person by the ankles, forcing them to sit helplessly on a low bench. The pillory, considered a more severe punishment, trapped the head and hands, forcing the offender to stand, bent over and completely exposed. A conviction for a minor crime, selling watered-down ale, baking a dishonest loaf of bread, public drunkenness, or simple petty theft, could earn you a day or two in this wooden embrace. But the confinement was only part of the punishment. The true horror was the audience. Being locked in the pillory was an interactive experience. You were a living target, completely at the mercy of the crowd's mood. They would not just stare. They would jeer, they would insult, they would spit, and they would throw things. At first, it might be soft, rotten fruit and vegetables, a smelly and humiliating barrage. But it could quickly escalate. Mud, animal dung, dead rats. And rocks were all common projectiles. A day in the pillory was not just an exercise in shame. It was a physical ordeal that could leave you bruised, bleeding, and seriously injured. Forget cancel culture on social media. Their version was a much more direct and organic affair, involving a live audience and a torrent of garbage. Certain punishments were designed specifically for women. The most famous of these was the cucking stool or ducking stool. This was a chair, attached to a long wooden pole on a fulcrum like a seesaw. A woman convicted of being a common scold, that is, a woman who argued with her husband, gossiped too much, or was generally considered a public nuisance, would be strapped into the chair. She would then be wheeled to the nearest river or village pond and repeatedly dunked into the cold, filthy water, much to the delight of the gathered crowd. It was a ritual of public humiliation designed to silence a woman who was deemed too outspoken. While presented as a comical event, it was incredibly dangerous, with women often dying of shock from the cold water or simply drowning. For similar offenses, a woman might be forced to wear a scold's bridle or a brink. This was a horrifying iron cage that was locked over her head, often featuring a metal plate or spike that was inserted into her mouth to hold down her tongue, making it impossible for her to speak. She would then be paraded through the village, led by a rope, a silent and terrifying mourning to other women. Why was this considered fun? For one, it was a powerful reinforcement of the social order. By publicly punishing and shaming those who broke the rules, the community reaffirmed its own values and drew a clear line between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. It was a real-life morality play, with a clear villain and the entire town acting as the righteous chorus. Furthermore, in a life of endless, monotonous labor, the misfortune of a neighbor was a major event. It was a break in the routine, a source of high drama and excitement. It was a reality show where instead of voting someone off the island, you were encouraged to throw a rotten turnip at their head. This strange fusion of justice and entertainment reveals the harshness of their social world. Shame was a powerful tool of social control, and the suffering of others was not something to be hidden away. It was a public spectacle, a lesson, and for many, one of the best shows in town. But even this was just a prelude. This was the opening act for the ultimate live event, the final, irreversible performance that no one in the village would ever miss. The stocks in the pillory were the opening acts in the theater of justice. They were designed to humiliate, not to kill. But for the most serious crimes, for murder, for treason, for heresy, a final, irreversible performance was required. This was the ultimate live event of the medieval world, a spectacle that drew bigger crowds than any fair or festival. This was the public execution. In our modern world, the act of state-sanctioned death is hidden away. It happens behind prison walls, witnessed by a handful of officials. In the Middle Ages, the exact opposite was true. The execution was, by design, a public act. Its power lay in being seen. It was the most potent and terrifying sermon the authorities could deliver, a lesson preached not with words, but with a rope, an axe, or a fire. The day of an execution was a major public holiday. Work in the town and the surrounding villages would cease. People would travel for miles, often camping out the night before to secure a good viewing spot. The atmosphere was not one of somber reflection. It was, to our modern sensibilities, a shockingly festive one. Vendors would move through the crowds, selling ale, meat pies, and trinkets. Minstrels might play tunes. Friends would greet each other. It was a day out for the entire family, a grand, grim, and unmissable social gathering. The performance began with the procession. The condemned person would be led from the local jail to the place of execution, which was often a gallows erected on a prominent hill outside of town, or a scaffold built in the central marketplace. This final walk was a crucial part of the ritual of shaming. The prisoner would be paraded through the streets, sometimes tied to a cart, a target for the jeers, curses, and projectiles of the crowd. A priest would walk alongside them, loudly urging them to make a final confession and save their soul, turning their personal damnation into a public lesson on the importance of repentance. The scaffold was the stage. Here, before the final act, was the moment of high drama. The condemned was often allowed to address the crowd with a final speech. This was their one and only moment on the world's stage, and the crowd would fall silent to listen. Some would confess their crimes and warn others not to follow their path. Some would protest their innocence, trying to win the sympathy of the crowd. Some would die with a curse on their lips. These speeches, these final words, were the original viral content, repeated and retold in every tavern and household, for weeks to come. Then came the main event. If the crime was theft or murder, it was typically hanging. The hangman, often a reviled but necessary figure, would adjust the noose. A final prayer would be said, and then the cart upon which the prisoner was standing would be pulled away, leaving them to dance their final, horrifying jig at the end of the rope. At the moment of death, a great collective gasp or a roar might erupt from the crowd, a release of the immense tension. For crimes of treason, or for those of noble birth, the execution might be beheading, considered a swifter and more honorable death. For heresy, the most terrible crime against God, the punishment was the most terrible of all, burning at the stake, a slow, agonizing spectacle designed to purify the heretic's soul with flame, while terrifying anyone who might share their forbidden thoughts. Afterwards, the body was often left on display for days, sometimes weeks, rotting in the sun, picked at by crows. It was the final, gruesome punctuation mark on the state's message of absolute power. Why was this considered entertainment? For the authorities, its purpose was clear. It was the ultimate deterrent. It was a way to maintain order through terror. But for the thousands who gathered to watch, it was the most thrilling story imaginable. It was a real-life morality play with the highest possible stakes. It had a clear villain, a dramatic procession, a climactic speech, and a very definitive end. It was a communal ritual that reinforced the shared values of the community, the power of the law, and the authority of God. It was terrifying, it was a chilling lesson, and it was a form of entertainment that left an indelible mark on the soul of the community. We have journeyed through the strange, chaotic, and often brutal landscape of medieval entertainment. We began with a simple question: what did people do for fun in a world before the internet, before the very concept of modern entertainment existed? Now, as we draw our journey to a close, let's take a moment to unwind the threads and see what the complete tapestry of medieval fun really looked like. What we have seen is not one single world of fun, but two, starkly divided by class. For the peasant, the vast majority of the population, fun was a desperate and precious thing. It was a physical and communal eruption, a temporary ceasefire in the long war against labor and hardship. Their entertainment was found in the noisy, gossiping, brawling community of the tavern. It was found in the explosive, drunken release of a holy day festival, a sanctioned moment of chaos in a life of rigid order. It was found in the raw, energetic music of the fiddle and pipe, and in the shared, fire-lit magic of a well-told story. And it was found in the violent, chaotic unity of a village football game, a sport that was less a game and more a semi-civilized riot. Their fun was organic, it was free, and it was born of the need to come together and momentarily forget the bleakness of their existence. For the nobility, Leisure was something else entirely. It was not an escape from their life. It was a confirmation of it. Their fun was a carefully curated performance of their own power, wealth, and martial prowess. It was the individual high-stakes glory of the joust, a form of celebrity athleticism played out in shining armor. It was the brutal, profitable, and chaotic business of the melee, a battle royale for the rich and powerful. It was the highly ritualized theater of the noble hunt, a day-long drama reinforcing their dominion over the natural world. And it was the quiet, intellectual warfare of the chessboard, a game that mirrored their political ambitions. Their fun was expensive, it was exclusive, and it was almost always a form of work, the work of maintaining and displaying their own superiority. And then there were the universal entertainments, the strange and often unsettling spectacles that captivated everyone, rich and poor alike. There was the genuine wonder brought by the traveling show, the acrobats and minstrels who provided a rare glimpse of a world beyond the village boundaries. And there was the darker side of the human spirit, a shared thirst for visceral, violent spectacle. This was the world of the blood sport, the bear-baiting pits and the cockfighting rings, where the brutal struggle for survival was turned into a spectator sport for gambling and thrills. This same impulse found its ultimate expression in the theater of justice. The public square became a stage, not for plays, but for the real-life suffering of their fellow human beings. The jeering crowd at the pillory, the morbid curiosity at the ducking stool, and the massive, festive gathering for a public execution were all forms of entertainment that blurred the line between justice, social control, and a kind of horrifying popular spectacle. So what is the picture that emerges? It is a world whose concept of fun is almost alien to our own. Theirs was a world where fun was public, not private. It was physical, not digital. It was communal, not individual. Their multiplayer game was a village-wide brawl that ended in actual bruises. Their binge watch was a storyteller reciting an epic poem over 3 consecutive nights in a smoky hall. Their doom scrolling was listening to a traveler's grim, month-old news of a plague in the next county. The fundamental difference, the one that separates their world from ours, is choice and access. Their fun was dictated by the seasons, scheduled by the church, and strictly limited by their social class. It was a rare and precious commodity. Our fun, by contrast, is a near-infinite on-demand buffet. We are never more than a click away from any movie, song, game, or piece of information we desire. They had to create their fun from the raw and often brutal materials of their own lives and communities. We consume ours through a screen. And that difference reveals more than just a change in technology. It reveals a profound change in what it means to be human, to be bored, and to seek joy. We consume our fun through a screen. They created it in the mud and the firelight. It is a world that seems by every measure to be harsher, crueler, and less fun than our own. And yet, before we close this book and retreat into the comfort of our modern silence, it is worth asking one final question. In our ascent from their world to ours, was anything of value left behind? What we have lost, it seems, is the absolute necessity of community in leisure. Their fun, from the tavern to the tournament, was a shared experience. It was loud, messy, and forced them into direct, unmediated contact with each other. Their entertainment required their physical presence. Our entertainment so often requires only our private attention, delivered through headphones and personal screens. We have gained a world of choice, but perhaps we have lost a world of connection. We have also lost a connection to the physical, visceral nature of play. Their joy was tied to a body, the exhaustion of a frantic dance, the roar of a crowd felt in your chest, the bone-jarring impact of a wrestling match. We experience so many of our thrills vicariously through the nimble thumbs of a gamer or the curated adventures of a vlogger. We have, in many ways, outsourced our adventures to our digital avatars, keeping our own bodies safe, comfortable, and profoundly still. But let us not romanticize the past too much. What we have gained is immeasurable. We have gained the incredible luxury of safety. Our games do not, as a rule, end with broken bones or mortal wounds. Our public squares are not stages for ritual humiliation and death. Our children can play with a freedom from everyday peril that would have been unimaginable to a medieval parent. And perhaps we have gained a capacity for empathy. We are, we hope, a world that no longer finds pleasure in the organized suffering of animals, or sees the public execution of a human being as a festive day out. We have relegated that kind of brutality to the realm of fiction, to the stories we consume on our screens, rather than the spectacles we witness in our streets. We have gained the distance to see cruelty for what it is. It is a strange trade-off. They lived in a world of profound, soul-crushing boredom, punctuated by moments of intense, physical, and often dangerous communal release. We live in a world of constant, low-level stimulation, where true silence and true boredom are states to be feared and avoided at all costs. They had no choice but to engage with the world and with each other. We have an infinite number of choices, most of which allow us to disengage completely. And now, as this story ends, as we power down this one last distraction, we are left with the silence. But it is not the threatening, empty silence of the medieval night. It is a quiet of our own choosing. It is the comfortable, safe, and private darkness of our own rooms. Perhaps the ultimate luxury is not the endless variety of our entertainment, but the simple, quiet power to turn it all off, to choose silence. A choice that for them was never an option. It was just the long, dark, and unyielding reality of their lives. And now, perhaps it is time for our own quiet, time to sleep.